Now the question I want to ask today, actually this sort of series of questions, begins like this. How do the financial markets exemplify and embody the operations of what I've called the interaction diagram? In other words, that generalized paradigm of interactivity whose three moments are immediate participation, enabling communication, and reflective proliferation. Now we know that the global financial network, like the epistemic culture of high-energy particle physics, is a sign processing machine, which presents itself to its operators, the traders, as an immersive environment, an endlessly fascinating global life form in which they can participate through their screens. To perceive the continuous transformations of the market is therefore to engage in self-perception, perception, not preception, or apperception, as Norsutina says, using a word from phenomenology and phenomenological psychology. By the same token, to engage with the market, to make the market through decisive acts of placement or withdrawal of money, is to engage in a strangely externalized or extroverted form of what Foucault calls care for the self. So, il y va de la subjectivité. It's a matter of subjectivity in the financial markets, but of an externalized or extroverted subjectivity. A subjectivity whose essential moments are no longer considered to be within the body in the depths of the psyche, but rather are externalized as machinic operations, appearing on the screens as pixels, really, as movements of light, appearing through audio-visual means, etc., appearing in a mediated, machinic, properly machined form. Now, if traders and bankers and so on are the privileged subjects of contemporary society, it is because they are able to intervene in this externalized and fractalized self, whose changing curves and figures and contours exert a decisive influence on the world, creating a common condition of alienation, to be sure. But alienation is always the most common thing in capitalist societies. Through its extension, its sophistication, its real-time intensity, and above all through the wealth and power over material production that it concentrates, the financial sphere has become the model for contemporary devices, or machines, if you will, of subjectivation. A break from this cultural pattern, emancipation, would require an existential intervention, the shaping of another environment, another sensuous and machinic surround, marked not by the calculated fascination of continuously unfolding temporal objects, but by the appearance and disappearance of aesthetic and symbolic singularities, which might help to open perception to the presence and processuality of human destiny. This is the idea I want to develop in this first part of the class, actually, with reference, as promised, to Félix Guattari and his schizoanalytic cartographies. So I kind of gave you just a glimpse yesterday of, not of really what's at stake in the book, but of these diagrams which, for some reasons that we'll try to get into, were essential to Guattari when he wanted to formalize a way of doing psychotherapy that would result in other things than the family therapy of Monia Caim and of the systemic therapist, the Palo Alto School in general, and which would also go beyond the situations of families or individuals into the social realm. So that's, you find that in this book, Cartographies, Schizoanalytique, which unfortunately isn't translated into English, but it probably will come out soon because you know, recently the untranslated books of Guattari have been coming out. This is just a page from it, which includes the diagram that I've tended to use because it's maybe the clearest, but necessarily one must use several of these diagrams. So I just translated it into English like that. Now I'm going to start explaining this thing, and it's going to take some time to explain it, and you could potentially go on doing that for quite a long time, and probably start some experiments, if you really wanted to get into it, which would involve leaving behind the diagram, the book, and everything else, and getting into things that are really, really interesting. But for today, we'll stick with this sort of thing. Now, the basic idea is that Guattari wants to present 4 different instances of the unconscious. This is not a model of the unconscious, but rather what he calls a meta-model of 4 different varieties of the unconscious. It's a meta-model because, according to Guattari, everyone is making models all the time, partially consciously, partially unconsciously, and these 4 different zones are really zones where modeling is carried out. The fact that some of them are on the side of what you could call giving or enunciation, that point, you know, where speech is in the process of coming out, and so before reflexivity can possibly happen. In other words, the idea that we would be in a moment of upwelling, which generally would not be conceived as being conscious, and therefore you would wonder, how can there be modeling going on? But for Guattari, modeling does not only take place in reflexivity, and indeed it does not only take place in language. It also takes place through the production of affects, through the production of gestures, through the production of resonance between individuals on the basis of expressions. So there is, on this side, we're going to have, therefore, to look at primordially at 2 sides of a 4-fold diagram. One side which is about the giving, and the other side which is about the given, or to put that in more familiar terms, one side which is about the subjective, and the other side which is about the objective. And you can see that here it would be a matter of deterritorializing, or as it were, displacing, changing, making strange, becoming other of enunciation, so it's subjective deterritorialization. And here, what's interesting are processes of objective deterritorialization, which affect content, or what you could also call expression. I'm going to go on with these confusing things, and maybe it will even get more confusing, but just hang on for the ride, and gradually, as you become more familiar with what's being talked about, something more tangible will begin to appear. Now, another way to look at that is to use this thing here, which is excerpted from the book that kind of goes along with Cartographies Analytique, which is Chaosmosis. A great, great book. Guattari's most well-written, most incisive, most brilliant book. Obviously, I recommend it because, Chaosmos. The subtitle is An Ethico-Aesthetic Paradigm. So, in a way, you have 4 different axes. This would be the side of the virtual, and this the side of the actual, this the side of the possible, and this the side of the real. And of course that gives you different things. That gives you universes of the virtually possible, territories of the virtually real, phylum or families of the actually possible, actual because it's actually been expressed, it's actually content, it's actually objective, and finally flows of the actually real.
What do you mean by territories of the virtually real?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay, because it seems like the concept of territorialization, which Guattari and specifically Deleuze and Guattari is not opposed to, but happens maybe prior to territorialization.
Well, you will find that the way that Guattari explains himself in Schizophysical Cartographies is somewhat different. Not all. There's not necessarily a total continuity. It's kind of like Foucault who said, "Allow me. Don't check my papers. You already check my papers when I cross the border. Please don't check my papers when I write a book." So there is and this is even a strategy of Guattari to keep things from becoming systemic. He doesn't want systemic thought. And maybe there's something, this will help you understand also 1,000 plateaus in different ways. So I will, obviously, this is the main thing to explain. Your question is immediately an important question. So it would seem in fact that one should start with the territory, with the existential territory. And territory for Guattari is completely ambivalent, by the way, because even though there can be a lot of negative things about territory is also existential in his terms. In the psychotherapist terms, this is, in a way, the point from which you would begin. So what does he mean by territory? Territory is an ethological concept. It comes from the animal world, of which we are a part. It describes that area which the animal has made into its familiar space, its hunting space, its grazing space, its vital space. For human beings, it's a familiar space. It is, in a way, the ground, the experience of the ground, experience of the reiterated ground. This can be any sort of ground, really, and it isn't just the ground of an individual. The existential territory could be the space of coupling. It could be the space of birth, of course. It could also be a collective experience. Indeed, there's a collective relationship to territories. Anyone who has lived in a village, in a town, in a city, in a nation knows this very well. The collective nature of a territory which a multiplicity inhabits. Territory, at the same time, is also the threat of the experience of what Guattari calls a black hole. By this he means an inability to separate oneself from the territory, a kind of plunge almost into the mud, a kind of gluey immobility, a pathological condition of osmosis, indeed, where there is no separation between the self and the territory, the I or the we and the territory. And so there is an implicit and often explicit and often pathological threat in this category of the existential territory, even though it is the vital category par excellence. And in a way, the existential territory is the category of the body. But the idea that there is a body without something else is a dualistic idea that is not really at stake here, because the territory is in a relation to these things that he calls constellations of universes. Another expression for that, there wasn't quite room in the square, but in a way I would have preferred to put there universes of reference or of value. It's another one of the phrases that he uses for this. Now what he means by this is, on the side of giving, that is at the moment of enunciation or of emergence or of upwelling, this is something like the realm of a more or less patterned and rhythmical sensation. That is to say, ideas which are not formalized, which have not been coded, which have not become objective expressions, ideas in this kind of nascent and upwelling state. And these ideas appear rhythmically. They imprint, or they generate, better yet, they generate a rhythmical experience in the body, in the territorial body, if you will. And so it is in this sense that there's a virtuality of the territory. The virtual is being brought into contact with the actual here already. And it's in that sense that there's a possibility of the deterritorializing movement from this sort of this connection to the territory, which you could also think of in classical psychoanalytic terms as a repetition compulsion, by the way. I'm just throwing that out right now. Never read that in Guattari, but I think it's very interesting to think of that because there's a lot of that in contemporary societies, you know. So the big question for Guattari is, one of the biggest, most important things for him is this: what is the character of this? Which is not reducible to aesthetic experience, although certainly it contains aesthetic experience. We're talking about universes of reference, that is to say, that to which subjectivity it refers. In a way, it's an outside, but it's an outside to which you direct yourself, or which directs itself to you. And if you think about your own experience, I think you might be able to do something with that kind of idea.
But doesn't that outside, it is a reference to something maybe external to ourselves, but doesn't that exteriority come from within?
Well, I don't know if the exteriority and within it. Let's say it comes. I mean, I don't really know what to do with whether. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know if it's necessary to answer that question.
Well, I think it is necessary because the whole movement that you see Guattari making, and once again, it's hard to separate him from his writings with Deleuze too, is one of immanence that reacts against this exteriority of subjective possibility that is purely transcendent.
I would rather not get into that. I'd rather try to explain to you what Guattari actually writes in Cartographies, Analytique, and then we can see how that makes sense or not, you know? Because if you and I are going to argue about what is or is not Deleuze and Guattari and so on and so on and so on, I think it would become not so interesting. So it's better to try and put it out, and then we can see, because of course we'll have plenty of time to discuss all this, okay?
Could I ask a very simple question?
Yes, of course.
Sorry, I think I might have missed it, but have you talked already about the relationship between the little boxes on the bottom and then
The little ones. Oh yes, of course I have. I mean, this is this idea that this is the axis of the virtual, and this the axis of the actual.
Thanks.
Here the axis of the possible, and here that of the real. And therefore you have these different possibilities. You know, you have these different combinations. That's a kind of combinatory system.
I see.
And so the territories are virtually real to the extent that when you are in the experience of this kind of immediate and indeed imminent experience of the territory, which has not been affected or afflicted by a deterritorialization, there's something virtual about that reality, because it has not yet stepped outside of itself. It has not yet entered the social domain in any way, and it doesn't have any. There's no way that we can seize what is objective about it. And indeed, this is where the patient withdraws, you know? And that's what he means when he's talking about a black hole. Guattari had a very cosmic imagination, but he's thinking very much of the withdrawal of the person who is in a pathological condition. And therefore, this idea of the virtually real becomes a potential. Of course, it's an inherent potential, but it can also be a problem. There is a good book, finally, about Guattari, and particularly about it has a good chapter about the schizoanalytic cartographies, and I think that's great because there hasn't been up till now anything about it that's really useful. So to talk a little bit about this virtual side the map, the cartography. Guattari, General Watson says, Guattari quotes the following sentences from Merleau-Ponty regarding the relationship between experience and science. And Guattari quotes, therefore, Merleau-Ponty says, all my knowledge of the world, even my scientific knowledge, is gained from my own particular point of view, or from some experience of the world without which the symbols of science would be meaningless. So there's an opposition here between experience and symbols. The whole universe of science is built upon the world as directly experienced. And if we want to subject science itself to rigorous scrutiny and arrive at a precise assessment of its meaning and scope, we must begin by reawakening the basic experience of the world, of which science is the second-order expression. That's really interesting, and that gives some clues into maybe what Guattari was gesturing toward when he said that cybernetics has put us behind the phenomenological inquiries which had come before the advent of cybernetics and of structuralism. They put us far behind. So these are some of this is the kind of phenomenology that we want to refer to try and understand this virtual or subjective side of his map of human experience. So Jenna Watson goes on saying the dimension of experience belongs to the right side of Guattari's graph, to the universes and territories. It is non-discursive, affective, and to be distinguished from scientific knowing. Guattari's preferred adjectives for this level of experience are chaosmic and pathic. So this is where chaosmosis comes from, and pathic. Please.
I was just curious about the relationship on the four territories. You know how like everyone relates to each other, correct? Except there's no relationship between the rhizomatic phylum and the existential territories. My question is, therefore, does it have to present itself by virtue of its relationship to the universe of constellations and the semiotic energy flows? Or
this is one of the few things that Guattari really built into his diagram very deliberately. It does indeed. To get to any of the sites, you have to go through in one direction or the other.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, you can't go directly. There are no diagonals in this diagram. Very interesting, that, yeah. So, Guattari's preferred adjectives for this level of experience are chaosmic, or chaosmic, whatever you're going to pronounce it, and pathic. Pathic knowledge is knowledge as existential transference, as non-discursive transitism. It is not to be confused with knowledge tied to the discursive realm of representation, which lies within energetic spatial temporal coordinates. This is not to say that Guattari dismisses scientific discursive knowledge, obviously not. On the contrary, he insists that discursivity is inevitable, that it is part of our apprehension of the world. He explains that discursivity has to do with us being thrust into energetic spatio-temporal flows, which are part of life. Capitalist discursivity is a cancer, he concedes, but not discursivity as such. So what we're going to be getting to is the relation to this understanding of the virtual and this understanding over here of the actual. And indeed, this is somewhat different than the way things are presented in A Thousand Plateaus. So I have another quote here. I wanted to kind of reveal this side that's concerning us. Examples of chaosmic and pathic apprehension can be especially salient in mental pathology. Psychosis can be described as a chaosmic stasis. This is the black hole thing, in which a sense of being in itself is established before a discursive scheme, uniquely positioned across an intensive continuum whose distinctive traits are not perceptible by an apparatus of representation, but by a pathic existential absorption, a pre-ego, pre-identificatory agglomeration. So this is a fusional experience, and Guattari does not hesitate to cite Le Roi Gourand, which is someone, an anthropologist, who made a great deal of, placed a great deal of emphasis on fusional states. This is generally considered taboo by the more objectivist approach to reality, but Guattari, you will find him quoting, not all the time, but once in a while, Le Roi Gourand. So, such a state is not limited to pathological conditions, but it is often most palpable there. That is to say, the experience of mental patients makes clear this dimension in a more, not in a pure state, because actually it never occurs in a pure state, but in something closer to what it is, because you can find, especially in psychotic patients, a kind of, there's a kind of cosmic trance which occurs, which can be either extremely painful or exalting, but which precludes any otherness, which expands to fill the universe, or which contracts into a kind of dense core of pain, if you will. Guattari explains to an interviewer the idea developed in cosmosis. The mental apprehension of the world, the fact of being in the world, is essentially a chaosmic apprehension. One is abolished in the world starts to be for itself. I am in the world because I am the world. I absorb and I dissolve all discursivity while affirming this discursivity. But in general, this time of fusion, of absorption, goes completely unrecognized or is even thought. One of the peculiarities of Guattari himself is that he admitted that he was God most of the time, as I mentioned yesterday. So he was capable of sort of not fighting it as much. And maybe this is why he was such a weird guy. I mean, maybe this is something about him that allowed him to discover some things.
Wait there. Can I copy this quickly?
Can you copy this? You can. It's in your notes
Oh,
already.
Is there any reason that discursivity?
There is no reason that this. Excuse me, that's my mistake. You want it today?
Oh, I was going to say, I have this Watson book for anybody that wants it too.
It's also in the.
That is it on
Yeah, the PDF is. Yeah. So she says, and she puts it this way. I don't entirely. I'm not sure I entirely agree with her entirely, but almost anyway. So I'm going to present her interpretation. She says schizoanalysis. So in other words, Guattari's style of treatment, which he and Deleuze theorized, but which he tried to somehow practice as a therapist. Schizoanalysis opens up new possibilities for the libido in the unconscious by choosing the deterritorialized option. Guattari, at this point, says that this is really the thing that psychoanalysis focused on, and schizoanalysis is going to focus on this side. Obviously, this is the big thing of Deleuze and Guattari, right? They're into deterritorialization, right? So, placing the emphasis on the deterritorialized option. Locating the libido in the phyla, that is to say, over here in the rhizomatic ideas, it allows for a process-related energy which pushes dynamic relations into the far from equilibrium conditions necessary for transformation and creation. This is the domain of the actually possible, or she says the actual possible, discursive yet deterritorialized. Schizoanalysis likewise rescues the unconscious from the territories, elevating it to the equally deterritorialized incorporeal universes of reference. This constitutes the unconscious as the set or ensemble of lines of alterity, virtual possibilities, and unheard of becomings. That's a quote from Guattari himself. The relation between the libido and the unconscious can then become one of processes of singularization predicated on two-way exchanges between the two sides of the graph. This is a point where I don't know whether I can really entirely agree with this. Comes right here, because the way Guattari says it is that there's a. Well, no, I guess not. I guess I perfectly agree. I guess I'm fine with that. So the point is that schizoanalysis, confronting a world of blockages, of stasis, or of a kind of repetition compulsion, where you have a patterned circulation between the four elements of the graph in such a way that it can even be frozen and controlled in a controlled space, like the shopping center or any of the other modeled and strategically constructed spaces that proliferate in the world today under the aegis of this interaction diagram. In the face of that kind of blockage, of that kind of black hole, of that kind of stasis, of that kind of infernal repetition that really characterizes our society, schizoanalysis takes what he calls here the deterritorialized option. In other words, we'll work preferably in these domains, insist on these domains, not to take these domains away from the other domains, not to insist that, because this is where everyone gets it wrong, I think. The wrong way to read 1,000 Plateaus, and certainly the wrong way to read Guattari, in fact both, is to say that it's all about these elements. It's not. Certainly not. The idea is to modulate the way that territorialization occurs. Territorialization is fundamental. We live on the ground. We live with the earth. But the question is, in what kind of mobility do we live with the earth? Please. And so, it's not a question of exalting the virtual as such, because there would be no meaning of the virtual without the actual. The question is, in what kind of rhythm does the relation between the virtual and the actual take place? And so this question of the rhythm that I tried to bring up yesterday is a fundamental one. Therefore, the deterritorialized option. Now, nor is it a question of focusing on one of the aspects of experience, because as he shows with this diagram, what existence is about for the individual, but also for the group, is a circulation between the different planes of consistency, which together make up something like what he also calls a plane of consistency, but a plane of consistency with a kind of graph-like structure. And so the idea is to understand the circulation between those different things. Now, what does that really mean? It can mean, of course, it can mean whatever use you find for it. And this was the point. This whole way of thinking was advanced in a seminar that he developed with Monia Kaim and with a whole group of therapists in Paris. These were primarily therapists. You can find the text of this seminar on the website of, what's that journal called in French, the one that's really associated with the psychoanalytic side, that Deleuze and Guattari actually founded. Do you know that, the name, because it's escaping me now? Chimère. So you can find the notes of this seminar, the complete sort of notes of the seminar on the website of Chimère. If you read French, and you're interested in this, it's a valuable source for understanding that. So the idea was to advance something which could be useful, first of all, in the therapeutic world, and then more broadly in the world of the 1980s that confronted Guattari and his friends when these ideas were being elaborated. So what would that mean? That would mean that you encounter someone and you try to understand how it is that they understand and feel their experience of a territory. In fact, the encounter necessarily means that you're somehow going to enter, to one degree or another, this territory. To enter this territory and to understand how it's mapped out by the subject supposes some kind of understanding of what appears to them as what Guattari calls a ritournelle, or this returning rhythmical experience of patterns which can range from something rather immediate, the kind of memory of a ray of sunshine, or of a breath of air, or of the image of these mountains when you walk out. But Guattari insists that this could also be music by Chopin, or a mathematical figure, seen not in its analysis, but rather in its that way that mathematics relates to music, okay, and its pattern, and that comes back in this figure of the ritournelle, which means that it's coming back. It's rhythmic and it comes back. It's a repetition that isn't constant. Therefore, it gives a kind of a pulse. So you would want to. Now you can feel that in any human group very clearly. I mean, if you think about your experience, up here on the hill, generally, and satisfait. Think about it this way. Think about it without words. Try to feel it, and you will feel something of a territory where the virtual and the actual are meeting, where the virtual and the real are meeting to form, on this side, where you have this relationship between an experience of an ethological experience and an aesthetic experience, really. I mean, something like this is to get away from categories like the imaginary, of course. It's another way of talking about those things in a different way, and it has its reasons to be different. Now, the whole interest for Guattari is how you obviously leave this sort of black hole to territorialize in a different way, to complexify, for life to be complexified. And life becomes complexified on two levels. On the level of the actually real, which is a level of flows. It's about language, it's about libido, it's about money, it's about gasoline, it's about everything that flows, according to Guattari, because it's experienced in time. But these flows are, he says, segmented. They're cut up, they're made discrete. They present themselves not as feelings, not as ritournelles, they present themselves as quantities, as objective things, as actual machines, physical concatenations of things, of language, of libido, to the extent that libido is the biological energy that impels human beings into motion. When he says libido, he's thinking about biological energy, and Guattari was not afraid to biologize. He thought it was better to biologize than to structuralize. So, the point of the diagram is to go from the virtual to the actual, and it's to look at the relation between the actually real and the possibly real being the domain of course, of ideas. Ideas present themselves as discrete things, right? But there's a difference in the virtually, in this possibly real here, which is the very difference of the rhizome from a concept. The rhizome proliferates and escapes. And this means that it continually draws you beyond yourself, for better or for worse. This is why, and this certainly holds for Deleuze and Guattari together, there is no refusal of science, philosophy, and all that. These are part of humanity. And the way that they carry you away from what used to be yourself is fundamental to the human experience. What is to be done with that really is to embrace it and modulate it. It's the question of the rhythm, of the directionality, but it will always exceed you. You as such will always be deterritorialized by this relation between rhizomatic ideas and semiotic energetic flows. So what the reason he's trying to get at this is really double. Because this here diagram, if it were only this diagram, and if all these things were stable, could be the diagram of a control society. Could very easily be that. If you were naming particular things, if you could model all this out and make sure that all these boxes were filled with perfectly identified quantities, if you could pipe in here a kind of music that would affect a certain kind of body and bring it into a certain kind of production and consumption and relate that to a certain kind of technological transformation, one that would be favorable, of course, to endless growth and endless accumulation, you would have the complete diagram of a capitalist society, and you could even have what Guattari called, yesterday we saw, the program of a device like a shopping center, or like any controlled population. So the point lies in this circulation here, which we saw before, the circulation, and the point is also that you should, I guess I should read something before I get to the second point. Yeah, okay. Let's read what Guattari himself says. He says, the important thing here is not only the confrontation with a new material of expression, That's the important thing when you move. You deterritorialize, you move into an encounter with a new material of expression. In the cases of, here he's discussing a patient, you know? And so the idea is a patient who's stuck in a repetition, in a black hole, in a ritournelle which is going nowhere. One thing to do with that patient, and they did this all the time at the clinic of Laborde, was to give that patient something different, a different role to play. They could play a role in the kitchen. They could do they could prepare a different dish than yesterday. They could take part in a game, in a theater play. They could do work. They could the teacher of Guattari was a guy named Tosquelles, and he had the patients work. He had to actually work taking down the walls of the asylum. It's brilliant. They actually captured that on film, and some film of Tosquelles during the war. And so you see the patients, you know, who are mad, right? I mean, who have difficulty grabbing a hammer and so on, taking down the walls that formerly held them stationary in the asylum and opening up this asylum which is out in the country, you know. So they're encountering a new material of expression. That material of expression is not only the tools that they use to take apart these walls, it's also the space that they encounter, and it's also each other whom they encounter in the process, and so on and so on and so on. So this is what Guattari is talking about here. He says, the important thing here is not only the confrontation with a new material of expression, but the constitution of complexes of subjectivation, multiple exchanges between individual, group, machine. These complexes offer people diverse possibilities to recompose their existential embodiment, to escape their repetitive impasses, and to re-singularize themselves. And for him, this question of singularizing is fundamentally important because it is the singular which will escape from the calculations of the control society, essentially, that he understood so well. So transferential graphs are affected, not from ready-made dimensions of subjectivity crystallized into structural complexes. So this is an argument against psychoanalysis, including that of Lacan, but from a creation which as such implies some kind of aesthetic paradigm. In such a context, the most heterogeneous components may work toward a patient's positive development, an involvement with architectural space, economic relations, the co-management of the vectors of treatment by patient and caregiver, a willingness to take any occasion opening up to the outside world, a processual use of event-driven singularities, everything that contributes to an authentic relation with the other.
Sorry, you said something about a critic against Lacan and
Yes.
Can you explain?
Of course, yes.
Please?
You know, of course, transference, okay, major concept in psychoanalysis. He says that in these complexes of subjectivation, these multiple exchanges between individual, group, machine by which he understood the materiality of flows, you know, not just materiality and ideality of flows, the relation between those two things. Transferential graphs are affected. There's something of otherness. Transference is the instance of the other in the self, as it were. But they're not from. He's saying that you can't understand these transferential graphs if you think it's just the graph of some preconceived, ready-made dimension of subjectivity crystallized into a structural complex, essentially the Oedipus complex. The structural complex is the Oedipus complex. It's the triangle. That's the thing that all of Guattari's work was about, taking apart and complexifying. And indeed, the reason we're talking about 4, we'll come to that, is that 4 is an unstable opening onto the multiple. He believed that the triangle and the binary form were stable, either one collapsing into the other or a dialectical relation where the two become the one. So 4 is the beginning of multiplicity for Guattari, and of course this is a critique of structuralism itself. You notice that these things that I was talking about, I wasn't really thinking about, but architectural space, economic relations, and then we call the co-vectors, the co-management of the vectors of treatment by patient and caregiver. These are exactly the things that Tosquelles, the anarchist Republican psychiatrist, practiced out in the countryside where Uri and Guattari went before they founded the clinic of Laborde. Because you had this guy named Tosquelles, who was an anarchist in Spain and who fought with the Republicans, and who was a psychiatrist for the Spanish Republican Army during the Spanish Civil War. And so he established a clinic about 50 miles from the front, as a matter of fact. And he experienced great success with his extremely unusual methods of treatment, which consisted in exactly this kind of thing. And it went to the point where the question of the co-management of the treatment by the patients and the staff became of the essence for Tosquelles in this clinic of a place called Saint-Alban. Alban is A-L-B-A-N, Saint-Alban. Now there's something fascinating about that. That means that, first of all, that Tosquelles thought that the doctor could never cure the patient, because much as Bateson sees the world as organism plus environment, Tosquelles thought that the pathology of the patient was sustained as much by the entirety of the clinic as it was by the village around the clinic. And this is an idea that Uri and Guattari carried to their clinic of Laborde very, very strongly. But someone else carried this idea somewhere else. The someone else is another psychiatrist who went to do their training and become a doctor at the clinic of Saint-Alban. That's Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon then went to Algeria, to Blida, and he started to institute the ideas of Tosquelles, which included the sort of daycare where people live at home and come to the hospital during the day, which at the time was a complete breach of the structure of the asylum, with its closure, with its carceral nature, and so on. So Fanon went there, began to work as a psychiatrist, and the story at least is, or he must have told the story himself, that one day he looked at what he was doing and he said, what these people need is not a psychiatrist, but a revolution. In other words, the only way, from this outlook, for people to cease being pathologically ill and caught in some kind of black hole, if you will, in some kind of stasis, would be to change the very social structure in which they participate. So this co-management of the vectors of treatment by patient and caregiver is a very, very much a revolutionary concept, and you can see the extent to which that was influential when you know that that was one of the driving forces of Fanon's conversion from being a psychiatrist to being a full-fledged revolutionary. And then this willingness to take any occasion opening up to the outside world, this processual use of event-driven singularities, everything that contributes to an authentic relation with the other. Exactly what Baudrillard says has disappeared from the world of computer-managed experience, So I find it really interesting. I mean, I don't think Guattari was thinking of Baudrillard when he wrote that, but I think this confrontation between the two is really revealing, because it says a lot about this. Why Guattari was so focused on these singularities. He was focused on them because he saw there that which resists calculation, that which resists the instrumental use of representation. And indeed, if you go on to the diagram, if these were not being deterritorialized and transformed by these, if the actually real were not being changed by the possibly real, then you could find yourself with discrete quantities that could be calculated and put into a pre-ordered structure. But it is the influence of the virtual that makes actually something possible. It makes possible what Guattari calls an agencement collectif d'énonciation. I think it's kind of nice to translate it as an articulation of collective speech. Énonciation, to the extent that it is not a programmed speech. It is an actual speech, that is to say, it contains the new, which is the possibility of an encounter. Because that means that the ground on which we will meet someone is not a ground that has been laid in advance. It is a ground which unfolds through the action of collective speech. And Guattari never gave up on this at all. He never gave up on the political, because all of this is not just a possibility of treatment. It's the possibility of creating political collectives, collectives which can take part in activism, which can take part in political processes, which can spur different kinds of revolutions. I mean, Guattari also never gave up on the idea of the molecular revolution. That is to say, the transformation at the level where one's own immanence encounters that virtuality which is going to, take it away. I mean, he thinks that this is as much a revolution as the changing of the guard in the palace, potentially much more. So this whole diagram is meant to be a diagram of political practice as much as it is of a therapeutic kind of practice. I want to make sure where am I going from here. Yeah, to another quote. So another quote from this, from Jenna Watson. She says, this two-axis plane of consistency, or in other words, the very diagram that we've been looking at, is an ontological model meant to map self-reproducing, self-managing existential processes. I would add that at the same time, the model continuously engenders itself, as if it were an auto-reproductive or auto-poetic drawing. Each set of terms added leads Guattari to make another drawing, another iteration of the four quadrants. It is this auto-generative capacity that attracts Guattari to four-part models. And then here we have a quote from Guattari where he says, two-term axiomatics of the being-nothingness sort can only lead to a disempowered representation and an inaccessible Grund. Whereas three-term dialectics lead to pyramidal arborescent determinisms. It is only with 3 plus n entities that there can be established a trans-entity generativity and proliferation, which is therefore that you have not a structural diagram but a matrix, which is productive, which is generative, without any entity taking essential priority over another. And that's very important because it means that, for instance, the territory is not a neglected category. Nor the constellations of universes, nor there is no one that's more important than the other. They are important insofar as they are a matrix, and that matrix will produce other categories. It's not limited either to what we see, and therefore there is this proliferation in the book. And indeed, on the back cover of the book, Guattari says that these maps are valuable. These maps are valid as long as they're valuable, and when the day comes that they are no longer productive, generative, when they're no longer a matrix, they are simply to be thrown away. Which is that kind of thing that a truly living person is able to say about their own work. It's pretty fantastic. So, so that is only with this 3 plus n entities that there can be established this trans-entity generativity and proliferation, and B, a principle of auto-affirmation, auto-retroaction. The foundation, which is auto-transcendent, in Jean-Pierre Dupuy's terms, or auto-poetic, in Francisco Varela's terms. And now this auto-poetic character, I mean, that came back again and again during the course, because it is a major thing for Guattari, because only the auto-poetic generative existence can escape, can escape from the this overcoding, which is one of the key words, I think, of it's clearly a key word for Guattari. And if you read Thousand Plateaus in what I think is the subtle way, you see that overcoding is in fact characteristic of empire, and empire is the condition in which we live. So this ability to control is, if there isn't something which creates the new or the singular, therefore something which is auto-poetic, auto-reproductive, then you wouldn't have a way of imagining the outside, of imagining the possible, and so on. For the Italian Autonomie philosophers, there is a word for this which is much more economic, much more Marxian, and so on: self-valorization. It's not the same word, doesn't mean the same thing, but it gets very, very close, and for exactly the same reasons. the notion that the working class is able to valorize itself, to give it itself its own value, and therefore to create, on the basis of that value, its own civilization, its own ideas, and to follow its own destiny beyond what can be imagined. That is where you can see how something like Autonomie and something like Deleuze and Guattari can meet perfectly, as they did. So,
Can I also ask, maybe, I don't know if it's a
yeah, now
distraction
let's,
or
let's talk
how
about it a
this
little.
relates to his theories of fascism?
How it relates to theories of fascism? It relates to theories of fascism as well as it relates to theories of control, yes. I mean, fascism is not the thing that preoccupied Guattari in the 80s, because it wasn't the big problem immediately there, right? But I mean, you know, in the Anti-Oedipus and in Thousand Plateaus, you obviously have, you know, the thing about faciality is where, you know, fascism is discussed. Here these works, fascism isn't. It always comes back in Guattari's text, but I don't find it the most. I don't think that his most important elaborations were carried on with respect to that problem, to tell you the truth.
Because there is something with territory and
Yes.
editorialization and these moments of
Yes.
grounding.
I mean, let's draw the fascist diagram, you know? Let's place here a number of symbols. Let's put them to music. Let's make flags which wave rhythmically in the air, you know? Let's consider that this is the outline of you name your country, you know? Let's consider that this here is the form of the army, that is to say when the people become mechanized and motorized, and let's place here a kind of science which cancels itself, which crushes itself into this kind of immanence that is a controlled, you know, segmented, which has no outside, and then we'll have a diagram of fascism, you know. That in the 80s that wasn't the problem. In the 80s the problem is that you have, I mean, something like finance, which actually does escape, you know. I mean, which is actually, I mean, it's escaping all the time, right? But the effects that it's producing is a patterned kind of expansion, right? Or really what he actually sees more than expansion, he sees this intensification, intensive imperialism that he talks about in that text on Unlikely Revolution. So, but of course, the interesting thing about the diagram is that if you move through it so that it changes, then it's a diagram of emancipation. If it's filled up so that it stays the same, it's a diagram of repression of control. And he does say that very explicitly in the Cartographies. So we can discuss any objections. Now that I've kind of finished, I wanted to sort of finish because otherwise it would be too difficult, but feel free to comment, object, withdraw, and so on and so on.
No, you know when they talk about these molar and molecular constructions, I think in Anti-Oedipus they very much emphasize on the fact that by that they never meant individual versus collective. But this is something they just say, and I don't think they really elaborate on it. You know, I mean that molar versus molecular is not ultimately individual versus collective, and that they're not actually going for another sort of individualism.
Oh, certainly. Oh, yeah, they do elaborate that a lot. Yes, but maybe now.
So they always say yes. This is definitely not individual versus collective. But then they say just repeat without really elaborating.
I don't know if that's true.
I don't think that's true at all.
That's true.
I think that when they use these binaries, these grand structural binaries that kind of develop the narrative of A Thousand Plateaus, whether it's macro versus molecular, individual versus collective, what are big other ones they use? I don't know. But I think that their point is not that. Their point is exactly that these binaries do exist in the world, and that they are what territorialize and structure our existence. But their use of those binaries is to show that those binaries are not, it cannot be boiled down to a singular of this is the molecular and this is the molar, right? Or this is the state and this is the individual. It's like those things in themselves are constituted by an internal difference. That and this is why it's not the 1 and the 2 or the 3. It's that we have these binaries with the relationship between them. So we have 1, 2, 3. But what's 4 about them is that these binaries are never stable. That they're constantly being destabilized. That they're constantly being rife through with antagonisms that need to be kind of teased out or explored.
Antagonisms are reorganizations. I mean, the reason why Guattari was so fascinated with the physics of Prigogine was precisely for that reason. You know, Prigogine developed his ideas from chemistry. Molar and molecular are terms from chemistry, right? The molar refers to a compound. The molecular are the sort of like constituent parts of the compound. That's an idea in chemistry, not in like atomic physics, right? So Guattari always used that. That's not, you know, particularly, he never really got into the chemistry, but what he did get into was Prigogine's understanding of phase changes and of the these moments of singularity where this, which is the moment of chaos, where reorganization takes place. That for him was a perfect, it was as though there in reality was this very thing of territorialization, deterritorialization, or chaos, where a liquid is going from being a liquid to being a gas, and then there are other such phase changes in nature. This is just the most simple example. At the moment where it's becoming a gas, it's not certain at all what kinds of dynamics that gas will have, because in that moment there's a moment of chaos, of unpredictability, of singularity. And so that would be the moment of deterritorialization. And this deterritorialization is, by its very essence, a multiplicity, whether it takes place in an individual or a group. So the group can also be completely molar. The individual can be completely molar. They can be both can be completely territorialized, completely stuck in a repetition. The point is that there's a kind of dissolving of the fixity of the patterning, and that's what interests Guattari, not for itself, but in its processual interruption of one pattern and its way of giving way or opening up the possibilities of other patterns. And the reality, not just the possibility of other patterns, but the reality. That is to say, it's not just about a kind of philosopher's dream of infinite possibility. It's also about what semiotic and energetic flows by which you can think the social movement, which is something that Guattari was constantly involved in. You know, I mean, he would go down and work with the striking nurses, you know. He started to do experiments with, basically with the Minitel, with a group of striking caregivers in a hospital. Some of the first sort of electronic activism that's ever been done, certainly the first in France that was, I think, ever done, you know. Pretty interesting stuff, actually, and very practical, because it's, you know, right at the heart of struggles. I mean, Guattari was a little different than most philosophers. He would go in the street quite readily. He was not a stranger to crowds and to collectivities and so on and so on.
But you know, I think the way they finished on the Oedipus, when they were talking about that ultimately any deterritorialization will be accompanied by a new reterritorialization, that is precisely, I mean, you know, the whole Oedipus complex or the castration complex for Lacan is basically the logic of the law, and that, you know, there is nothing outside of the law. So it is sort of the same enunciation of the same Lacanian.
I don't think so, because it's a new territorialization. It's a new territorialization. The re here is only a re in the sense that it means, you know, from res, you know, from things, you know. It's the territorialization is by its essence different. And that is what's generative about the process. I mean, that's what they're trying to say. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I mean, the whole point was to find a logic that wasn't a logic of the reproduction of the law, whether it be the deterministic laws of science or symbolic laws of social structure. I mean, that's the idea. Now, whether this idea holds up or not is up to everyone. Whether it's useful to you or not is up to you. But certainly that was the idea. There's no question about that.
So it seems to me that the idea of that, I mean, at the end of the book, they kind of seem to me that they kind of say, well, will ultimately be within the law.
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
or
I think
particularly.
you need
I don't
to
think so.
also read the end to Anti-Oedipus, which is, 1,000 Plateaus.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's like Anti-Oedipus comes to this conclusion about kind of the way things are, and 1,000 Plateaus elaborates the kind of autopoietic potential of deterritorialization in different fields, such as like music or biology or science. And if you're interested in the phase change aspect and how that maybe relates to politics, Delanda's work is all about kind of this relation between science and history, and teasing out more of the actual mathematics and chemistry that would support kind of a Deleuze-Guattarian view of the world. And there's a real interesting debate in that mathematics between Badiou coming at it from an algebraic set theory, topology for ontology, and Deleuze and Guattari coming from more of a differential Riemannian geometry that takes place. Great article by Daniel Smith that elucidates the distinction between the two.
Could you communicate that article to
Yeah, I
everyone,
can give that
including
article.
myself?
Yeah,
That would be
yeah,
nice.
it's a fantastic article. And then also, if you're interested in fascism and the political, I was going to say, in Guattari's work, Tre Ecology, Three Ecologies, it kind of elaborates that a little more. And when he talks about molecular evolution in Brazil in particular, Guattari was fascinated with Brazil and spent some years there doing some empirical research. That's really interesting, but to read that's absent the theory, but really goes into the question of politics and what was happening in Brazil at that time.
I actually redid the translation of that book. There's a good friend of mine who made it, Swedi Rolnick, and there's interview with Lula, which is really, really interesting. It's like the kind of the most political, but it's all, the whole book is about politics. He does meet with psychotherapists quite a bit, and so you get quite a bit of psychotherapeutic politics as well. But he also meets with a lot of different kinds of activist groups, the kind of activist groups that were federated or brought into made consistent together, by the PT, by the Workers' Party in Brazil, and that makes that book kind of a hands-on book of Guattari. You see the guy kind of walking around, and how does he open his mouth, and because that's basically all that he does. But what kind of effects does that produce to go around and talk with so many different people, so many different kinds of groups? I don't know, high school students, homosexuals, There's just like an infinite thing. I mean, it's kind of vertiginous after a while. Let's hear some more things from this. I mean, this gets into the ethereal, but you see, the reason for getting into the ethereal is to ask yourself, what would be the beginning of a kind of transformatory relation or transformatory antagonism with the types of equilibria, of dynamic equilibria that are characteristic of the present society. That's the point. That's the point of counterposing this to all the development on the way that the financial sphere operates and the way that connects to the sort of on-the-ground facts of production, distribution, and exchange.
Can I ask a
And
question?
also to the built environment, by the way. Please, you can ask a question.
In that respect, I was wondering if those possibilities don't lie in that axis of movement from the real to the possible specifically, because I see the resemblance between this and the positive feedback diagram in both areas here.
That's right. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Exactly.
If we want to ask the question, what is the way out or the exit door, it has to be in that axis of movement, which I presume is bidirectional because it's bidirectional.
Well, it's bidirectional indeed, and it's also, it also goes around in both ways, you know? And so it's not just, I mean, it's not just a matter of like this to this, because you have to kind of think about that if this is where stuff gets built and, you know, wars get fought and publishing houses get started or whatever, you know, this sort of thing, it's interesting that you can only get like from here to there by going through here, by going through, say, the body, the pathic, the territorial, you know. It's interesting that you can only change this, this very important category here, which is kind of where it all begins, because this is where you start to come out of your body, you know, through the, that you can only get from here, from say something you would build, through the escape of the unbuilt, that which is codified but which is recodifying itself in motion, you know, and therefore opening up possibilities of other building. But those possibilities of other building are going to depend on bodies making a new step. So it's going to have to alter something in the way that the dimension of patterning and of rhythm emerges in subjectivity. So indeed, there's a relation up and down, but there's also a pulsing relation. And I think the pulsing relation is what really interested Guattari. And it interested him also because it is a relation, again, not necessarily between individual and society, but between a kind of dense existential reality and a more open, segmented, proliferating one. So, I mean, you can put family here, you can put tribe here, you can put individual here, you can put catatonic here very well. You see what I mean?
May I add something more?
Just as the emphasis on always on deterritorialization without understanding the moment of reterritorialization as a new territory. I mean, that is the new territory. That is the realm of you know, it's actually possible. I mean, that's the whole point, actually, in so many ways. And there's a kind of prohibition on thinking about that too, because that's about engagement. I mean, where else would engagement take place? Of course, this whole thing is about engagement, but if you are systematically leaving out that moment, it's as though you just cut out this part of the diagram. You know, you would place yourself in a kind of psychotic stasis where you have a mobility sort of in the air of theory, but no mobility on the ground of political relations and social relations. And no machinic mobility either. No mobility when abstraction actually begins to shape the built environment and all that. So therefore, no capacity to propose. And I think that the liberal trap is really there. I mean, there is a trap with liberalism. It's clear. It's abundantly clear. It's you know, we're in the midst of it.
Shall we take a break?
Shall we take a break? That sounds like a good thing.